It is hardly news that honeybees live in hives and have a specialized worker caste. Some of the workers bring in pollen and nectar. Others tend to hive duties, which include taking care of the queen, the only reproductive member of the colony. Actually, there are at least 30,000 different kinds of bees, some large and some very small. A few live in colonies, but most of them are solitary. Solitary bees often nest close together, but each female constructs her own nest. The native alkali bee is one of the two most economically important solitary bees. It nests in bare or mostly bare horizontal ground with a moist top layer of soil. Under these conditions, alkali or salt accumulates at the soil surface, which accounts for the name alkali bees. The other important solitary bee is the alfalfa leafcutter. This imported species doesn't excavate its own nest, but needs pre-existing holes either above ground or in vertical banks of earth. It then uses self-cut pieces of tender leaves to convert the holes into incubators. These bees differ strikingly in size. The large ones on the feeder are alkali bees, the other is a leafcutter, but both are valued as alfalfa pollinators. Both species are individually more efficient than the honeybee in pollinating alfalfa. They usually visit it for pollen, and even when seeking nectar, they trigger the pollination mechanism. By contrast, honeybees usually visit alfalfa for nectar and in the process trip only a small percentage of the flowers they visit. We will consider the very different lifestyles of the two solitary bees in turn, starting with the alkali bees. This diagram summarizes the life cycle of the alkali bee. The overwintered prepupae start developing into pupae as temperatures warm in June. The male bees begin to emerge first and are ready to mate with the earliest females to appear. Even unmated females, however, will nest and lay eggs, and not all of the eggs of a mated female are fertilized. Fertilized eggs become females, and unfertilized eggs become males, but all viable eggs, whether fertilized or not, become larvae. The larvae that survive various parasitic and environmental hazards develop into prepupae, which hopefully will overwinter and perpetuate the population. If a cubic foot of soil is taken from a nesting site sometime between September and June, it may contain from 200 to 400 overwintering prepupae. The winter temperatures condition the bees to respond to later warming temperatures. They break dormancy after a few weeks of exposure to warm soil and then pupate a few days later. The pupae show many of the characteristics of adult bees. Even sex differences are visible at this early stage. The female pupae are somewhat more compact, and the antennae of the males already show their characteristic extra segment and additional length. The originally white pupae become fully pigmented within about 10 days and are ready to shed their skins and become adults. The males, which began emerging before the females, soon start to patrol the nesting areas looking for females. They often swarm around the first female to emerge. The males spend their nights clustered on tall pieces of vegetation or in cavities in the ground. The clusters break up in the morning when the bees return to their patrolling of the nesting site. Each female, whether mated or not, begins to dig a new nest on the afternoon of the day she emerges. Mating, or attempted mating, often takes place at this time. Once begun, she finishes her main burrow, which is usually about 5 inches deep, that first night. In contrast to the clustering males, each female spends the night in her own burrow. The nest mound, at first a smooth hillock, is later converted by the wind into a chimney composed of the congealed walls of the burrow entrance. At the lower end of her main burrow, the bee begins to dig a more or less semicircular, nearly horizontal tunnel. From the lower wall of this horizontal tunnel, she constructs a series of separate cells. After the number of cells has increased beyond 3 or 4, the bee builds a horizontal chamber with soil pillars as supports. Additional cells, up to 15 or so, are then hollowed out below the floor of this chamber. In a vertical section, usually only 2 or 3 cells are visible. The drawing shows an entire nest cluster in profile with its chamber and cells. Some of the completed cells are open to show food, eggs, and developing larvae. Also shown are 2 roughed out cells, and the adult bee putting finishing touches on a third. By persuading some alkali bees to live in a glass-walled nesting box, we were able to photograph nest construction. The bee tears the soil loose with her mandibles and backs toward the entrance, pushing the soil behind her. The tamping compacts the burrow walls. Cell completion begins with the bee bringing in fine particles of soil and tamping them around the periphery of the cell cavity until it is of proper size and shape and has smooth walls. The bee tamps the walls of her cells, as she does her burrow, with the specialized tip of her abdomen. Most of the alkali bee's nest construction is done at night. This bee, for example, was photographed at midnight. The term busy as a bee can be aptly applied to this species. To the smooth walls of the cell, she applies a waterproof wax-like material with her mouth parts. It is not yet known whether this waxy material comes from glands in the head or a gland in the abdomen. The complete construction of a cell characteristically takes about 12 hours. If you look closely, you can see her long, flexible tongue making several passes over the surface of the glass. After the cell is polished, the bee provisions it with pollen and nectar. She then lays an egg on the pollen, seals the cell, and plugs the short vertical lateral that connects it to the horizontal burrow. Alfalfa is the principal pollen source for the alkali bee because of the large acreages grown for seed. Although more choosy than the honeybee, the alkali bee collects pollen from a number of plants, especially introduced crops and weeds. Rocky Mountain bee plant is one of the few native pollen sources for alkali bees and may be its primary original host. This kind of flower, however, is adapted for pollination by a large, hovering insect, such as the sphinx moth, rather than a bee. The relatively small bee goes from stamen to stamen and/or enters the corolla cup and rarely touches the stigma. On any one foraging trip, an alkali bee may visit several kinds of plants. The pollen on the slide includes thistle, alfalfa, and goat's rue, all scraped from the legs of one bee as she returned to her nest. When an alkali bee collecting pollen also wants nectar, she tarries longer on the flower and sucks up the nectar after having exploded the floral mechanism. She visits from 75 to 150 or more alfalfa flowers to acquire a full load. Normally, she collects about a load an hour and works about 8 hours a day. It usually takes her only a minute or so to deposit her load in the cell. If her burrow entrance has been obstructed by trampling of livestock or other factors, she has trouble gaining entry. The first few pollen loads are placed in the cell without nectar. Thereafter, nectar is added in increasing amounts as the pollen mass is formed into a grapefruit-shaped ball. Most of the shaping is done as she lies on her back at the bottom of the cell and turns the ball around and around on her feet. The female lays an arched, banana-shaped egg on the completed ball, which is tipped at about a 45-degree angle. After the egg has been laid, the bee constructs a cell cap, seen here as if we were inside the cell looking up. The cap is started at the rim of the cell and is extended toward the center as a spiral rope. The cap, which is not waxed, is quite pervious to air and moisture. An alkali bee does not plug her main burrow, and consequently, a heavy rain during the nesting season is devastating. Water that gets into a cell usually ferments the pollen and kills the egg or young larva. The cell then becomes plugged with mold, which thrives on the fermented pollen. Older larvae can feed on moldy provisions, but the fungus often constipates and thus kills them. Since the alkali bee has so little defense against rain in the nesting season, it can flourish only where summer rains are rare. Experiments with fungicide applications are not promising, but shelters can be constructed over nesting sites to prevent damage from heavy rains. Fortunately, nesting does not appear to be inhibited under them. The cost of covering large sites may be prohibitive, but small areas can be covered as sanctuaries from which later population expansion can take place. Egg laying by successively emerging females continues from about early July until mid-August. This means that the first eggs will be developing through the various larval stages, while additional eggs are being laid. The egg hatches in 2.5 to 3 days. The first molt takes place within the egg membrane. We see here the second instar larva, which has already been feeding. The growing larva swings its head back and forth, scraping up small quantities of pollen with its mandibles. This larva appears to be in the third instar. Most larval growth takes place in the final or fifth instar stage. The final instar finishes the pollen ball in 4 or 5 days. Since the full-grown larva weighs about 1.5 times as much as the original pollen ball and egg, it is apparent that the larva takes on moisture as well as stored food. The full-grown larva is composed primarily of a huge midgut filled with undigested pollen. Like the cow, our bee feeds in a hurry and digests at leisure. After the larva has digested the pollen for about 2 days, it defecates for the first time and transforms into a motionless prepupa, which remains unchanged until the following summer. But development to a full-grown larval stage does not assure survival to adulthood. The larva may fall victim to the alkali bee's principal parasite, a bombyliid fly. The bombyliid is about the size of an adult alkali bee. The female fly hovers over the alkali bee nest mounds and flips her eggs into and around the nest's openings with her abdomen, hence the nickname bomber fly. Eggs are laid with each downward flip of the abdomen. The egg of the parasite hatches within a few hours, and the very active larva crawls down the alkali bee burrow and waits in the cell for the host larva to become full grown. The parasite then becomes attached to the host larva and begins to feed. It soon drains the fluids from its host, reducing it to a mere skin. The full-grown parasitic larva migrates from the cell and constructs its own overwintering quarters, usually a few inches above those of its host. The leathery bombyliid maggot is easily recognized. In the early summer, the mature fly pupates. Shortly before the alkali bees emerge, the fly pupa uses the hooklets around its head to bore to the surface, and then, while still firmly anchored, its pupal skin splits open and the adult fly crawls out while its wings are still moist and unexpanded. The pupal cases that are left behind after all the flies have emerged provide mute evidence of the parasitism that took place. The parasite, still soft and vulnerable to predation by birds, hangs itself up to dry on a nearby object. Youngsters are often hired to step on the flies before they're able to fly. Those that escape can be killed with a fly swatter when they return to balm the nests. Although admittedly primitive, this non-chemical control method cannot be accused of contaminating the environment. The adult alkali bees are victimized by a canopid fly. This parasite will perch on tips of vegetation and pounce on a bee as she approaches her nest. The canopid then inserts several eggs between the bee's abdominal segments. The eggs hatch into larvae that compete for survival in the host bee's abdomen. Only one parasitic larva completes its development. Here we see the successful larva feeding in the abdominal cavity of a dissected bee. The parasite always kills its host, but usually not until the bee has laid half of its potential number of eggs. Just before the fly larva pupates, the adult bee crawls into the nest and dies. The parasitized dead bee is easily recognized by its distended abdomen, which, when opened, is seen to be filled with the parasite puparium. Tiger beetle larvae are important predators of the alkali bee when they inhabit a nesting site. By the time the beetle larvae are full grown, their holes are about the same size as those of the alkali bee. The unwary bee that investigates such a hole is apt to be dragged below and consumed. Where natural alkali bee nesting sites do not occur near their fields, seed growers can sometimes create the right condition of moisture near the surface by constructing trench-like water reservoirs above gently sloping ground. A natural hardpan layer is necessary for this to succeed. Otherwise, the farmer has to construct a so-called artificial bee bed by lining a flat-bottomed basin about 4 feet deep with a heavy plastic sheet to prevent loss of water, and backfilling this basin first with a layer of gravel and then with suitable soil to the prevailing grade. Pipes conduct water to the gravel layer, which stores it and distributes it laterally. The burlap bags, filled with soil, wick the water toward the surface. Salt is added to control excessive vegetation and to help hold moisture near the surface. If alkali bees are living close by, natural migration may take place. More commonly, the alfalfa seed grower cuts blocks of soil from occupied sites, loads them onto trucks, and hauls them to newly prepared areas, often miles away. The growers frequently cooperate in this enterprise. The blocks are then placed in trenches and soil is placed around them and compacted to ensure proper percolation of moisture from surrounding ground. Since each block may contain 200 to 400 prepupae, a few hundred blocks can adequately seed an area with alkali bees. Then the grower simply has to maintain a favorable environment for his newly hired hands. Many seed growers don't use alkali bees as pollinators. In the Intermountain region, a popular alternative has been the alfalfa leafcutter bee, which would probably receive even more use if it didn't have so many parasites. Since the alfalfa leafcutter bee produces a partial second generation in the Intermountain region, it usually flies from mid-June until September. Usually, but not always, there is a population dip between generations near mid-July. Only a percentage of the first generation progeny emerge the same year, and as a result, the second generation population is sometimes relatively small. The prolonged nesting season allows alfalfa seed growers to pollinate several fields that come into bloom at different times. The progeny of the first generation that don't emerge the same year remain as prepupae from July until the following June. They are joined in September by the prepupal progeny of the second generation. As with the alkali bee, males always emerge slightly before the females. As soon as the females begin to appear, mating commences. Since each female tries to start her nest close to the one from which she emerged, traffic around a nesting board is sometimes exceedingly heavy. While they are nest building, these bees really earn their name. Pieces of leaf are used in constructing each nest, but unlike our native leaf-cutting bees, they much prefer the relatively soft leaves of herbaceous plants to the tougher ones of most trees and shrubs. The alfalfa leafcutter, although equipped with the typical leafcutter beveled teeth, which work like scissors, has trouble cutting anything as tough as this lilac leaf. The alfalfa leafcutter's natural nesting places include insect holes in vertical clay banks, beetle burrows in logs and stumps, but heavily wooded areas are not favored by these sun-loving creatures, and abandoned wasp nests. Incidentally, in such shallow holes as occur in a wasp nest, the bees lay only male eggs. In deeper holes, they help assure a male's first sequential emergence by placing their unfertilized eggs toward the front. These bees also nest readily in nail holes, spaces between shingles, and in pieces of tubing. Research soon demonstrated that they would nest equally well in many kinds of holes specially prepared for them. Regardless of the kind of nest hole the leafcutter chooses, she brings in a large number of leaf pieces and uses them to construct a linear series of leaf-lined brood cells. Each cell is begun as a cup composed of overlapping oval pieces. When the bees are induced to nest in glass tubes, it is possible to observe how they fasten the pieces to the nest hole walls by pinking the edges with their mandibles and using the leaf exudate as a glue. They fasten the overlapping pieces to one another in the same manner. Petal pieces, which they also utilize as nest-building material, are similarly fastened together. Sometimes a bee accidentally enters another bee's nest hole. Now, this can lead to a tug-of-war if the resident is at home when the mistake is made. As soon as the bee completes a cup, she begins foraging for pollen and nectar. The leafcutter works alfalfa flowers rapidly and can trip as many as 20 flowers per minute. However, because she spends a lot of time locating untripped flowers, her average is probably not more than from 5 to 10 flowers per minute. A diligent bee usually gets a full load of pollen in about an hour. When collecting pollen, she starts scraping movements with her front legs as the flower is exploding. When getting nectar, she puts her proboscis deeply into the flower without using her front legs. The pollen that showers onto her during nectar collecting trips is eventually scraped onto her abdominal pollen scopa or hairbrush. When returning to her nest with pollen, the bee goes in head first to inspect the cell. Then, before unloading her pollen, she backs out, turns around, and backs in. Her first load of pollen may be somewhat dry, but soon nectar is added with each load. The resulting rather pasty mixture is packed into the cell without any particular form. On the flat outer end of her massive nectar and pollen, the alfalfa leafcutter places enough nectar to form a very shallow lake. The egg is then floated on the surface of the lake. Although the bees get some nectar from alfalfa, other types of plants, such as borage, are visited primarily for nectar. After the bee lays her egg, she caps the cell with 3 or 4 circular leaf pieces The cap is slightly recessed into the cup so that the next cell can be fitted into it, and the entire series will eventually form a continuous tube. After the final cell has been capped, the bee places up to 40 circular pieces just inside the nest entrance. The last ones are carefully sealed to the entrance walls. As the larva develops, it feeds upon the nectar and pollen. The early stages feed at the surface, and the final one, which does most of the growing, dives into the mass and finishes it up. In this stage, the larva defecates as it feeds, unlike the alkali bee, but it anchors the fecal pellets away from the food with strands of silk. The full-grown larva spins a cocoon composed of silk strands cemented into a continuous sheet by a liquid secretion. The head end of the cocoon has a multi-layered nipple of white or light pink silk surrounded by a rosette of fecal pellets. The pupa, which, as in other insects, has many adult characters, needs about 10 days before it is ready to molt and become an adult. The alfalfa leafcutter is plagued by a number of parasitic wasps and scavenger predator beetles. The wasp, Monodontomerus, seen hovering in front of these nests, is typical of most of these parasites. After the bee larva is full grown and the cocoon has been spun, the female wasp thrusts her long ovipositor into the cell and lays from 5 to 15 eggs. Although the wasp is small, she can't reach many cells, especially when the nest holes are tight. However, she can crawl between the straws of soda straw units and lay eggs in every cell. The eggs are laid on the surface of the host prepupa, and the parasitic larvae feed externally, eventually overwintering within the host cocoon. They pupate before the host and emerge in time to reparasitize the leaf cutters, now in the pupal stage. The seed growers can prevent this by trapping them with ultraviolet lights. Another type of wasp, named Saphidia, suns itself on the nesting materials with the bees. It can be distinguished by its darting motions in slender form. It inspects several holes and then backs into one of them to lay a number of eggs through the cap of a recently completed cell. The wasp eggs hatch before the bee egg, and after a battle royal, only one larva survives. It must destroy the bee egg before it can dine on the pollen and nectar. Often it dies before it can penetrate the host, but unfortunately, the host always dies, whether or not the parasite succeeds. The full-grown Saphidia larva spins a cocoon similar to that of its host, except that the fecal pellets are scattered instead of rosetted at the head end. This wasp is becoming increasingly important and is difficult to control. Several species of carpet beetles and grain beetles inhabit leafcutter nests as scavenger predators. The carpet beetle adults are broadly oval, and their larvae are reddish-brown and remarkably hairy. The grain beetle adults are more slender, and their larvae are smooth with brown and white rings. Both types of beetles travel from cell to cell, consuming pollen and destroying many host larvae. Although potentially devastating, they can be controlled with good management practices, including proper storage temperatures, screening of cells, and poisoned baits. Seed growers who rely on leafcutter bees to pollinate their alfalfa soon learn to take advantage of the bees' nesting habits by placing on their outbuildings such items as drilled timbers, boxes of soda straws, and grooved boards fastened together. Finally, mechanization entered the picture in the form of gang drills and standardized units. This type of nesting material is the most popular at the present time. The units are economical and sturdy, but parasite and scavenger control is often difficult. In Alberta, a complete management system has been developed involving the use of molded polystyrene wafers packed into boxes. The colorful pattern on the surface of the nesting unit tends to attract the bees and assist them in finding their own holes. The pattern also brands the units and discourages hijacking. The felt backing is provided to minimize the moisture problem inherent to plastic material. The holes are purposely large to aid in ventilation and to facilitate cell removal. As these wafers are being separated, the nest may not seem to be very numerous, but you are only seeing half the nests on each wafer face. A machine was devised for separating the cells from the nesting material. Damage to both cells and plastic wafers is minimal. Obviously, the life expectancy of nesting materials in this system is considerable. The wafers are sterilized for reuse, and the cells are screened to eliminate scavenger beetles and unwanted debris. They are bulked in plastic bags for cold storage, which duplicates nature, but under controlled conditions. After cold treatment, the cells are placed in trays for incubation. The trays are taken to the field when the males start emerging and are placed in box-type field shelters above empty nesting units. Emergence and nesting follow. The shelters are always open to the east to catch the morning sun and to protect the brood from the afternoon heat. Wherever leaf cutters are used, the nesting units are distributed through the alfalfa fields in shelters of various designs. We have already seen the box type. The signboard with a roof shelter is a more primitive style. In A-frame shelters, the nesting units are parallel to the pitch of the roof, which allows debris to fall away from the nest entrances. This right-angle shelter is clearly movable. Incidentally, the grower in this instance makes his bees perform triple duty by moving them to 3 successive cuttings of alfalfa bloom. Shelters mounted on trailers represent the ultimate in movability. These thousands of alkali bees flying over a man-made nesting site in Idaho convey some idea of the huge populations that can be realized. If honeybees were more cooperative about pollinating alfalfa in most seed-growing areas, both the alkali bee and the alfalfa leafcutter bee would have remained as obscure wild species. As it is, however, these 2 species can now be spoken of as domesticated wild bees. You might wonder how one can handle masses of alkali bees like this without being stung. Actually, neither of the solitary bees we have portrayed in this film are aggressive. They will sting only when trapped against the flesh. The bees pay for their keep by doing their own thing for the seed producers, and the net result is a substantially heavier set of alfalfa seed than would be realized without the bees. Without assured pollination, an acre of properly tended alfalfa might produce 150 to 200 pounds of seed. With efficient pollination, the same field can produce 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of seed. And that sort of difference may determine whether a seed grower can stay in the business.